Hello friends, I am Mr. Samip Century. Today we will be doing biography of Vilfredo Pareto. Vilfredo Pareto was an Italian engineer, sociologist, economist, political scientist, and philosopher. He made several important contributions to economics, particularly in the study of income distribution and in the analysis of individual choices. He was also responsible for popularizing the use of the term elite in social analysis. He also contributed to the field of sociology and mathematics. Enabled in the 18th century, the Pareto family of Genovese ancestry had remained rooted in and were staunch supporter of Italian politics and high culture until the second quarter of the 19th century. Because of political danger and fear, the Marquis Raphael Pareto had fled to France, there marrying Mary Martiner, a Parisian, two daughters and one son, the Marquis Vilfredo Federico Damasco Pareto, 1848 to 1923, were born in France, but in 1855, 7 years after the birth of Vilfredo, on July 15, 1848, the Pareto family returned to a more peaceful and politically safe and stable Italy than earlier. The happy result of this repatriation for Vilfredo Pareto was his bilinguality in French and Italian. His youthful education in Italy was grounded well in traditional classical study, as was most prevalent at the time. Following his secondary education, Pareto entered the prestigious Polytechnic Institute in Turin. Where his 5-year course provided serious studies in mathematics, natural and physical sciences, and engineering, the latter being his chosen career. His graduate thesis for degree completion at the institute, entitled The Fundamental Principles of Equilibrium in Solid Bodies, proved determinative later in his study of society. Upon graduating in 1870, he took a position as a director of the Rome Railroad Company. For a while, later taking a managerial post as superintendent of the Iron Mines Production Company at Florence. In keeping with his breeding and pedigree, Pareto spent time amongst the aristocratic families in the high society saloons of Rome, while robbing soldiers with the high bourgeoisie of Italy. He espoused a passionate allegiance to ideals of democracy, republicanism, and pacifism. His father's well-known position was the same on all points. However, by the time Pareto reached the age of 30, he had denounced these family's ideals in exchange for a pessimistic and sometimes even nihilistic view of human society and politics. In 1876, the rightist party, which supported free trade policies dear to Pareto, fell from power, being replaced by a moderate leftist group who were in policy and practice opposite to free trade and leaned toward socialism and even communism. To this, Pareto was vehemently and outspokenly opposed. 6 years later, in an attempt to assist in turning the government around, Pareto ran for public office but was roundly defeated by the opposition he despised so much. That same year his father died, and not long after his mother as well. Pareto's whole lifestyle underwent a radical transformation, so that in 1889 he gave up the directorship of the iron production company in Florence, married Alessandrina Bakunin, a young impoverished Russian girl living in Venice, and moved to semi-retirement in a villa at Fiesole. Owing to the rich legacy and inheritance left him by his parents, Pareto was able to live a private life as a gentleman scholar without financial worry. He spent his early years at the villa and Fiesole translating the great classical, reveling in his ability to read 7 languages fluently, and more importantly, turning his attention to a serious study of economics. After his open rejection of his father's ideals, Pareto turned his violent criticism pointedly upon the new government socialistic tendencies, especially launching a fierce crusade against the government restrictions upon free trade in foreign and domestic policies. Italy's willingness to vote into power such a government shattered Pareto's early confidence in the virtue of humanity, cultivating now a cynical contempt for humanitarianism, republicanism, and progress. Owing to the publication of some of his brilliant essays in mathematics and theoretical economics, Pareto was called to the University of Lausanne. In April 1893, Pareto was an extraordinary professor of political economics. The following year, he was made a full and permanent professor of the university at the age of 46. His establishment as an international scholar of high repute came 2 years later with the publication of his 2-volume study entitled Course the Economic Politique. By this work alone, Pareto established himself as a major figure in economic theory for all time. Until 1898, and obviously under the weighty influence of the intellectual milieu of the university, Pareto was a casual supporter of liberal policies. But following the infamous May riot at Milan, Pareto's politics changed radically and he completely abandoned his hope for a liberal restructuring of Italian politics and government. He redirected his articulate furrow now against all expression of democratic ideals, while nurturing a rather all-encompassing hatred for liberalism generally. On one occasion, Pareto wrote, "I gave up the combat in defense of liberal economic theory in Italy. My friends and I get nowhere and lose our time. This time is much more fruitful, directed to scientific study." He despaired over debate, anguished over recalcitrance in government, and became in the process a cynical, rancorous, utterly disillusioned loner, at variance with all the dominant tendencies of the age, despising them with a pathological fervor without discrimination. Adding insult to injury, Pareto was dealt another serious blow. Beside a breach with family and friends over politics, the insult which naturally would have confirmed Pareto's hostile feeling about men came when one evening, when Pareto returned from a business trip to Paris, to find that Alessandrina, his wife, had absconded with 30 cases of his villa treasure, as well as with the chef, her lover. The blow was severe and determinative in the extreme. He never recovered, but became even more psychopathological with increasing age. His lack of optimism about humanity evolved into an aggressive religious denunciation of human effort at self-help. When Pareto went up to the University of Lausanne as a social economist, he found himself quite alone, being at the Faculty of Law, where he alone taught social and economic theory. Nevertheless, and in spite of loneliness and intellectual isolation, he moved quickly from extraordinary to full professor, and in 1896 he was elected Dean of the Faculty of Law. All the while, and aside from professional promotions, he was stifled in his efforts to reform and restructure the social studies curriculum at the university because of resistance and lack of cooperation from colleagues. Not only was his attempt to strengthen sociology thwart, his inability to realize success in teaching was evident to all. Despite all, he did the lecturing to beginning students. On one occasion, he expressed his revulsion for such teaching by writing that such teaching of the same material over and over again made him feel like a parrot. There may have been a parrot amongst my Darwinian ancestors, he wrote with sardonic bitterness. This would explain my uses of automatic language. Intellectual genius and pedagogical effectiveness are seldom complements of the same scholar, and certainly with Pareto, if the former was true of him, the latter most definitely was not. His lack of skill in such lecturing, being known by students and colleagues alike, led Pareto to reduce his teaching responsibility, eventually reducing his lecture time to 1 hour per week, yet retaining the chair of sociology. His instrumental fields continued for several years to be political sociology and the history of economics and social doctrine. Finally, in 1907, he relinquished the chair in political economy completely and became full professor of political and social science, teaching actually only 3 months a year. In 1909, after 16 years of teaching at the university, he gave up his teaching altogether, visiting the university campus and the city of Lausanne only rarely. To his villa in Seligny he retired. Like a snail in its cell, he was heard to lament to live out his sad and embittered life. A few years before, as noted earlier, Pareto had acquired a very considerable legacy in 1898 with the death of his father, and due to his now financial independence and coupled with his increasingly unhappy relations at the university, Pareto built himself a villa near Seligny, not far from Lausanne. Taking only the finest wine and culinary delights, his life of an independent scholar and man of means served well his scientific work. Continuing to write and study, he published in 1902 his now famous Les Esteemes Socialistes. Prior to publishing this work, Pareto had become convinced that the better part of human behavior is not guided by rationality, but rather by what he thought of as sentiments and feeling, superstitions, and similar non-rational factors. Attributing, for example, his failure to convince friends and family to favor economic liberalism and rational rather than non-rational factors of resistance, he became convinced that rational argument as such would continually fail to move the uneducated and recalcitrant masses of people, since they were by and large governed not by reasons but by non-rational beliefs, sentiments, fear, and the like. This position, which Pareto first revealed in an essay published in 1900, came to full development fruition in 1906 under the title Manual of Political Economy, followed 10 years later by a more thorough treatment of theory in his magnum opus of 1,000,000 words entitled Treatise on General Sociology, translated in English as The Mind and Society. It became his best-known work in the English-speaking world. owing to his rejections to democracy and in concomitant relief in humanity, ability to improve and advance by goodwill and self-determinations, Pareto welcomed Italian fascism in its early and beginning from under the banner of Mussolini. Mussolini is purported to have held Pareto as a political genius, saying even that the great sociologist's conceptualizations of the circulations and theory of elite was probably the most extraordinary sociological conception of modern times. To the early fascists, Pareto's political sociology provided a ready-made system for defense and propagation of their plans for Italy's control, and at first Pareto seemed pleased with the attention, but true to his integrity as a scholar and the free intellectual, when Mussolini dared to subdue dissent by stifling the universities in Italy and restricting free speech, Pareto wailed loudly. Fortunately, Pareto lived only long enough to see Mussolini's fascism in its fleeting form. Early in 1923, as he knew death was approaching, Pareto was finally able to marry Jeanne Rees, his long-time mistress and companion, by becoming a citizen of the city-state of Fiume, where his divorce of Alessandrina was recognized. At the age of 75, Pareto died on August 19, 1923. Following a brief illness, he is interred on his Siligny villa ground, simply and without epithets, saving his name and dates. Born in the year of Italy's embracing of liberal politics and economic policy, Pareto died just a year before the debilitating ascent of Mussolini's fascism and infamous March of Rome.